U.S. Army Platoon Sergeant Jorge Otero Barreto cautiously leads his point element back through the sweltering Vietnamese jungle toward a small communist-held village he's hell-bent on taking. Yesterday's attempt saw him hit by an RPG that almost took his leg off, but it'll take more than that to stop him from trying again. As the Americans take their positions, suddenly they're caught in an intense hail of gunfire. Within seconds, their machine gunner goes down wounded. Moments later, his assistant falls lifeless beside him. Vastly outnumbered, Otero Barreto knows the rest of his men will end up the same way if they don't get to safety fast. He gives the order to withdraw, but he doesn't go with them. His eyes are fixed on the M60 machine gun, now unmanned. His legs still throbbing with pain, he crawls past his fallen comrades toward the M60. It's now one man against an entire army. Jorge Otero Barreto was born on April 7, 1937, in the small Puerto Rican municipality of Vega Baja. His father named him Jorge, Spanish for George, after George Washington, whom he greatly admired. He hoped his son would one day become a military legend in his own right, envisioning him as a famous general. After completing high school, he studied biology at the University of Puerto Rico, but when his mother tried to make him go to medical school in Spain, he refused. In September 1959, with his father's encouragement, he instead enlisted in the United States Army at age 22. He later explained that he wanted to become, quote, somebody to be proud of. After completing basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, Otero Barreto volunteered for the Army's Air Assault School at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, so he could become a paratrooper. The rigorous training pushed him to his limits, but he persevered where others failed. In 1960, he made history when he became the first Puerto Rican soldier to graduate from the school. The following year, he was assigned to the 25th Infantry Division, specifically to the 27th Regiment, known as the Wolfhounds, and sent to Hawaii for training. Soon enough, he found himself continuing his journey across the Pacific with postings to Thailand and the Philippines, where he would learn how to navigate the many challenges of jungle warfare. But with the escalation of the United States' involvement in Vietnam throughout the first half of the 1960s, he would get his chance to put these skills into practice. Otero Barreto's first tour to Vietnam came as a military advisor and helicopter door gunner with the 117th Aviation Company. During this early deployment, he earned 3 air medals, along with his gunner's wings and crewman badge, flying dangerous missions across Southeast Asia, and he even claims to have participated in highly classified operations into North Vietnam itself. On June 6, 1966, Otero Barreto returned to Vietnam with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, one of the Army's most elite airborne formations. It was with the 173rd that he would truly prove himself as a warrior and begin accumulating the collection of wounds that would mark his body for the rest of his life. On July 21, 1966, during a combat assault in War Zone C, Otero Barreto's helicopter hovered about 10 feet from the ground. He jumped out, ready to engage the enemy, when suddenly he felt his right ankle caught in an excruciating grip. A Viet Cong bear trap had clamped onto his leg, immobilizing him completely. He later recalled, quote, "My outfit was receiving a heavy volume of fire from the enemy position, and the platoon had to maneuver to engage the enemy. Due to my handicap, I had to remain by myself in the LZ." For 4 agonizing hours, Otero Barreto lay trapped in the landing zone while his platoon fought the enemy. Only after the fierce battle ended could his men return to help him. The medic applied first aid and called for evacuation, but the bear trap had to be cut off at Bien Hoa Hospital before doctors could treat the puncture wound. Having survived this brutal encounter, Otero Barreto was awarded his first Purple Heart. Less than 2 months later, on September 17th, Otero Barreto was leading his platoon on patrol around the Michelin rubber plantation when they made contact with a Viet Cong force. After losing 2 of his men in the initial exchange of fire, Otero Barreto maneuvered to the right flank, only for an enemy grenade to strike a tree and explode, sending fragments tearing into his left leg. Despite the wound, he regrouped his men and recovered the 2 fallen soldiers, earning himself a second Purple Heart. However, there was worse to come. On March 6, 1967, Otero Barreto's squad moved forward after their lead element was caught in an enemy ambush. As a staff sergeant and squad leader, he immediately took charge of the chaotic situation. Moving through intense hails of bullets, he went from man to man, pointing out enemy targets and directing their fire. His men watched in amazement as their sergeant exposed himself again and again to incoming rounds, putting his life on the line. Then a bullet and grenade fragment struck him in the left buttocks, a serious wound that sent searing pain through his body. Any reasonable man would have called for a medic and waited for evacuation, but Otero Barreto refused to leave his men. Despite the wound, he continued moving through the fire, directing his squad's assault until they gained fire supremacy over the enemy position. Only after his squad was completely out of the hostile area did he finally accept medical aid and allow himself to be evacuated. At Long Bin Field Hospital, surgeons operated on the wound. 15 days later, it became infected and had to be reopened and cleaned, requiring another painful surgery that kept him hospitalized for about a month. For his wounds that day, Otero Barreto received his third Purple Heart, while his extraordinary heroism under fire, refusing evacuation while continuing to lead his men to victory, earned him the Bronze Star with V device for valor. On June 4, 1967, Otero Barreto's tour of Vietnam with the 173rd Airborne came to an end, and he returned home to Puerto Rico on a 30-day military leave. After his leave period ended on July 15th, Otero Barreto reported to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where he was assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, one of the Army's most storied units. Yet his arrival at Fort Campbell was anything but smooth. The details remain murky, but at some point during his time there, Otero Barreto assaulted both a sergeant and a captain. The exact circumstances of what provoked these confrontations has been lost to history, but the consequences were clear. He faced potential court-martial. For most soldiers, this would have meant the end of their military career, possibly even prison time. But Otero Barreto saw an opportunity. Rather than accept punishment stateside, he volunteered to return immediately to Vietnam. The Army, desperate for experienced combat leaders as the war intensified, accepted his offer. By December 1967, Platoon Sergeant Jorge Otero Barreto was back in Southeast Asia with Company A of the 101st Airborne's 502nd Regiment, 2nd Brigade, and quickly won the respect of the rest of the unit. Among the officers who served alongside Otero Barreto was Lieutenant John Hay, who later recalled his impression from their first night together in the field. Quote, "I noticed immediately he was very acutely aware of his surroundings. He was somebody I immediately trusted. He was that kind of guy. He was friendly, but he was all business, an extremely professional non-commissioned officer. For a young non-com, he was very mature. He was extremely conscientious. I trusted him with my life. I guarantee you that." He was particularly impressed by Otero Barreto's firm commitment to maintaining upstanding ethics. He remembered how on one occasion, the Puerto Rican NCO had admonished his troops for not respecting a deceased female Viet Cong fighter, saying, quote, "He was a man of great morals, which I admired. That's something I demand from my leaders." Shortly after Otero Barreto's second tour of Vietnam had begun, the war would enter one of its bloodiest periods. On the night of January 30th, 1968, as Lunar New Year celebrations took place across Vietnam, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong launched a massive coordinated assault in various parts of the south. What would become known as the Tet Offensive struck simultaneously at towns, cities, and military installations throughout the country. Even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon came under attack. Otero Barreto claims to have been one of the soldiers who landed on the embassy roof during the chaotic defense of the compound. The offensive caught American forces off guard, and the fighting was fierce and relentless. On February 1st, 1968, shortly after the Tet Offensive began, Otero Barreto's company commander, Captain Joseph Holland, was lost in action. Otero Barreto had been with him in his final moments. He later referred to Holland simply as "my old man," and the loss hit hard. With Holland gone and the company in chaos, Otero Barreto found himself acting as platoon leader for the battered 1st Platoon of Company A. They'd been fighting intensely for days, and casualties had been mounting. By the time things began to settle down in early February, Otero Barreto's platoon was severely under strength. Just 30 men remained from the original formation. However, they refused to let their bleak situation get the better of them. Otero Barreto later said, quote, "We were prepared, ready, and willing to go for broke." By this point, Otero Barreto had developed a philosophy that went far beyond standard military training. He explained, quote, "A warrior is somebody who's beyond himself. He doesn't love himself. A warrior is a person who's willing to give his life for his people." This wasn't abstract theory. It was how he lived every day in the jungle. He later said, quote, "I was trained in conventional warfare, but I learned about guerrilla warfare, which I learned from the enemy. To defeat that tiger, I had to know that tiger. Now, as the United States faced its darkest hour in the jungles of Southeast Asia, he was ready to prove just how effective he could be on the battlefield. On February 10, 1968, a young lieutenant named Richard Pershing arrived to take command of the 1st Platoon. Otero Barreto, who'd been acting as platoon leader, stepped back into his role as platoon sergeant. For the depleted unit, Lieutenant Pershing became, as Otero Barreto put it, quote, the 31st warrior. Just 6 days later, Otero Barreto found himself leading the point element during an operation outside Fire Base Jane. The coordinates marked a small village surrounded by heavy hedgerows, the kind of terrain that favored defenders and made attackers vulnerable. As Otero Barreto's point element moved across the exposed rice paddies toward the village, the enemy struck. Concealed inside the village with perfect fields of fire, North Vietnamese forces opened up with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy automatic weapons. The point element was caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Lieutenant Pershing, positioned with the platoon's main body about 75 yards behind, could only watch as his platoon sergeant came under withering fire. Then Otero Barreto felt the impact. An RPG fragment tore into his right leg. Though badly wounded, he maintained control, directing his men's return fire as they fought to break contact. Pershing immediately ordered a hasty withdrawal as the point element pulled back to join the main body at the command post. Both officers assessed their situation. They were in a precarious position, having just taken contact from an enemy force of unknown size. Before calling for a medical evacuation helicopter to extract Otero Barreto, Pershing and his wounded platoon sergeant made sure to send out security with observation posts. They were expecting a counterattack from the village at any moment. Half an hour later, the distinctive sound of rotor blades announced the approach of the dust-off helicopter. But as the medevac chopper descended toward their position, the village erupted with ground fire. Heavy automatic weapons raked the aircraft, forcing the pilot to increase power and abort the landing. The helicopter disappeared back into the sky. Otero Barreto later said, quote, "Despite my wound, I was forced to remain with my platoon overnight. God knows best." As darkness fell, American artillery batteries opened fire on the village. 105, 155, and 175mm guns, as well as 4.2-inch mortars, pounded enemy positions throughout the night. Illumination rounds lit up the sky, denying the North Vietnamese the cover of darkness. Trapped inside the village by the artillery cordon, the enemy had no choice but to remain in their positions. The ordeal continued throughout the long night. At mid-morning on February 17th, Otero Barreto was back at the point. His leg wound from the previous day is still fresh. The platoon moved toward the village. Lieutenant Pershing remained with the main body, waiting for contact. The North Vietnamese were patient. They held their fire as Otero Barreto's point element approached. Then, with perfect timing, the enemy opened up with everything they had. The first burst of fire wounded Otero Barreto's machine gunner and claimed the life of his assistant gunner. After ordering his men to withdraw and rejoin Pershing and the rest of the platoon, Otero Barreto made a split-second decision. Instead of going with them, he grabbed the now unmanned M60 machine gun and took over the position himself. Completely exposed to intense enemy fire, he opened up on the North Vietnamese positions, placing such a heavy volume of fire on them that they ceased firing on the rest of his point element and concentrated everything on him. Then another RPG fragment hit him, adding a fresh wound to the previous day's injury. But Otero Barreto refused to move. For over an hour, he held that position alone, firing burst after burst from the M60, keeping the enemy pinned down until his men reached safety. Only after he'd expended all the ammunition for the machine gun did he transition to his M16 rifle and begin crawling back toward the platoon's position. When he finally reached Lieutenant Pershing at the command post, Otero Barreto thought the nightmare was over for the day. He was wrong. Someone from higher command issued new orders: recover the body of the fallen assistant gunner and retrieve the M60 machine gun. Lieutenant Pershing passed the order to his platoon sergeant. The medic dressed Otero Barreto's second wound, and Pershing told him to eat something and prepare to take the point out again. Otero Barreto looked at the young lieutenant and said, quote, "Lieutenant Pershing, this time we have to accomplish this mission together." Pershing agreed. In his mind, Otero Barreto questioned the urgency of the mission. He knew the man had already perished. He was sure the machine gun had been destroyed. But in his own words, quote, "We were willing to give our life for our country. Warriors do not ask questions. They are just to accomplish the missions and obey orders. They cannot hesitate." The two men organized the platoon into a column formation with two squads abreast. Lieutenant Pershing on the left, Platoon Sergeant Otero Barreto on the right. Despite his 2 wounds from the previous 30 hours, Otero Barreto called in artillery fire to their front and inside the village as the platoon moved forward. They were halfway to the fallen soldiers' position when hell came wide open. Heavy enemy fire erupted from multiple positions. In the chaos, Lieutenant Richard Pershing was hit by RPG fire, slaying him almost instantly. The mission that should never have been ordered had claimed the life of the 31st warrior. Otero Barreto managed to recover Pershing's body, but the original objectives, the fallen soldier and the machine gun, were left behind. As far as Otero Barreto knew, the village was never taken. The enemy eventually withdrew and vanished into the jungle. But while the mission may have ended in disaster, it had made Otero Barreto into a legend. As well as his 4th Purple Heart, he was awarded a Silver Star. By May 1968, Jorge Otero Barreto and the rest of Company A had been redeployed as part of Operation Carentan II, conducting security operations in the villages and countryside northwest of Hue. The tactical situation in this region remained complex and dangerous. Following the Tet Offensive, North Vietnamese forces had dispersed into smaller units, but remained active throughout Tuat Tien province. On April 28th, Otero Barreto received orders for a combat air assault on the village of Phuoc Yen, located about 2 miles northwest of Hue. This would be no simple undertaking. Intelligence indicated that the village was occupied by the 8th Battalion, 90th MVA Regiment, approximately 600 seasoned enemy soldiers who had fortified the stocking-shaped village with bunkers, spider holes, and interlocking fields of fire. However, the Songbo River surrounded the village on 3 sides like a natural moat, leaving only one land route for escape. The plan was to trap them. Companies from 3 batteries would seal off the village, while artillery and airstrikes pounded the enemy into submission or surrender. Otero Barreto and Company A would be in the first wave. As his helicopter approached the landing zone, enemy fire erupted from the village. The pilot refused to land, hovering 6 or 8 feet off the ground and shouting that if they were getting off, they'd better jump now. Otero Barreto launched himself out of the helicopter with his men, landing under fire. The point element immediately began moving toward the village, across exposed rice paddies with minimal cover. They pushed forward through enemy fire and took a crucial line of trees about 40 to 100 yards from the enemy positions. As darkness fell on that first night, Otero Barreto found himself in a 2-man defensive position behind the trees. The American line was stretched dangerously thin, roughly 130 men from Company A holding hundreds of yards against the 600 entrenched enemy soldiers. Artillery illumination rounds lit up the night sky intermittently, and Otero Barreto rotated guard duty every 2 hours, while artillery periodically hammered the village ahead. The proximity to the enemy was unnerving. Otero Barreto could hear the North Vietnamese talking from their positions, the sound of an eerie bell ringing, voices yelling obscenities. They were close enough that he could make out individual words in Vietnamese. Sleep was nearly impossible. The next day, April 29th, Company A launched its first assault. Otero Barreto moved with the 1st Platoon as they advanced on 3 points toward the village. When they made contact with the fortified positions, the fighting was fierce. The 1st Platoon took out several enemy bunkers in close combat, but eventually the assault stalled. Company A had to withdraw, and artillery and airstrikes on the village resumed. On April 30th, Otero Barreto watched as South Vietnamese troops from the ARVN 1st Division, known as the Black Panthers, assaulted the village from their positions, only to be driven back by heavy resistance. Company A was ordered to try again in the same area they had assaulted the day before. Otero Barreto and the 1st Platoon moved forward once more, advancing on 3 points deep into the village, about 75 to 100 yards past their previous limit. Then the enemy fire intensified. An RPG struck one of the point men, claiming his life instantly. The machine gunner went down wounded. Under withering fire, Otero Barreto helped organize the withdrawal, once again fighting their way back out as more air and artillery support was called in. From his defensive position, Otero Barreto witnessed the most intense bombardment he'd ever seen. Over the course of the siege, more than 14,000 artillery rounds pounded Phuoc Yen. A staggering concentration of firepower on such a small area. Jets, helicopter gunships, and prop planes made 14 separate airstrikes, turning sections of the village into an inferno. During one attack run, Otero Barreto watched a Phantom jet get hit by ground fire and crash in flames. The most devastating strike came when jets pulled back to allow a final bombing run. When the massive ordnance detonated, Otero Barreto felt the ground shake beneath his feet even from a quarter mile away. The village was being systematically reduced to rubble, yet somehow the North Vietnamese continued to hold their positions. As the siege entered its third night, Otero Barreto heard something strange. A helicopter circling overhead with a PA system. The aircraft broadcast an eagle's caw, then messages in Vietnamese telling the trapped soldiers their position was hopeless and they should surrender. The message played in English as well, so Otero Barreto and his men could understand what was being said to the enemy. But the North Vietnamese weren't ready to give up. At 4:15 a.m. on May 1st, Otero Barreto's position came under a 60-round mortar attack. Then the human wave assaults began. Desperate enemy soldiers attempting to break through the American cordon and escape. Otero Barreto and his platoon opened fire as wave after wave of enemy soldiers charged toward their positions through the darkness. Referring to his relentless machine gun onslaught, he later said, quote, "When they kept coming, we began to dance." The Americans held firm. The North Vietnamese tried again and again, but each time they were driven back with devastating casualties, leaving bodies piled in front of the American lines. When the attacks finally subsided, Otero Barreto could see approximately 58 enemy soldiers lying lifeless in front of the U.S. positions. The breakout had failed, but it had cost Company A too. The second platoon had lost both their leader and platoon sergeant. Rather than give the North Vietnamese time to regroup and attempt another attack, the Americans realized it was their opportunity to push forward. The first platoon would lead Company A into Phuoc Yen, and Platoon Sergeant Jorge Otero Barreto would be at the front, leading the point element, the most dangerous position in any assault. They'd barely penetrated into the devastated village when the enemy opened fire. Despite the massive bombardment they'd endured, the North Vietnamese still had fight left in them. Rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns, and small arms erupted from concealed bunkers and spider holes scattered throughout the area. Most platoon sergeants would have sought cover. Otero Barreto charged forward. With complete disregard for his own safety, he immediately assaulted the nearest machine gun emplacement. Closing with the position under heavy fire, he took out all 3 crew members. Before the enemy could react, he rallied his squad and led them through the continuing fire toward 3 more fortified positions. Moving from bunker to bunker with calculated aggression, Otero Barreto and his squad overran each position in turn, eliminating or incapacitating every defender they encountered. After neutralizing the immediate threats, he swiftly repositioned his squad to occupy the captured enemy positions. From these vantage points, they placed effective suppressing fire on the remaining North Vietnamese forces, allowing the rest of Company A's platoons to maneuver into advantageous positions and continue the assault, eventually overrunning the enemy's strongpoint. Then came the moment no one expected. Instead of the bitter fight to the end the Americans had anticipated, a North Vietnamese sergeant emerged from the devastated village and surrendered. He was allowed to return and bring more soldiers out. One by one, then in groups, the demoralized survivors of the 8th Battalion began laying down their weapons and walking out with their hands raised. When the final count was made, the results were staggering. 107 North Vietnamese soldiers had surrendered, the largest mass surrender of North Vietnamese troops to an American unit in the entire Vietnam War. Another 419 enemy soldiers had been eliminated during the 4-day siege. Company A had not escaped unscathed either. They had lost 8 or 9 men and had 33 wounded, but they had achieved a decisive victory. For his extraordinary heroism during the final assault on May 1st, 1968, Platoon Sergeant Jorge Otero Barreto was awarded his 2nd Silver Star, less than 3 months after his first. The official citation, issued by Headquarters 101st Air Cavalry Division on August 11, 1968, specifically praised his, quote, "initiative, outstanding bravery, and strong personal leadership despite overwhelming enemy superiority in both numbers and firepower." Meanwhile, the tactical approach used to devastating effect by Otero Barreto and his comrades at Phuoc Yen, establishing a tight cordon, using overwhelming artillery and air support to trap and demoralize the enemy, then forcing their surrender or destruction, would be studied and adopted by the U.S. Army. It became known as the classic cordon maneuver of the Vietnam War, a tactical innovation that would be taught and employed in future operations. After his impressive actions in 1968 that had seen him awarded 2 Silver Stars, Jorge Otero Barreto continued serving in Vietnam for another 2 years. By the time he left the country in 1970, he'd completed 5 tours over 9 years, during which he'd volunteered for more than 200 combat missions and had been wounded 5 times, earning 5 Purple Hearts. In addition, Otero Barreto also received 5 Bronze Stars with Valor devices, 5 Air Medals, 1 for every 25 helicopter missions, and 4 Army Commendation Medals. In total, he was awarded 38 military decorations during his service, making him one of the most decorated soldiers of the entire Vietnam War and the most decorated Puerto Rican soldier of all time. In the years following his departure from Southeast Asia, Otero Barreto battled with PTSD. He would say that the war had left him with 9 ears. His ability to detect even tiny sound in his surroundings would have him constantly on edge. Yet realizing he was not suffering alone, he dedicated himself to helping his fellow veterans, becoming the commander of the American Legion Post 14 back in the Puerto Rican municipality of Vega Baja, where he'd grown up, and working as a service officer to ensure other soldiers received the benefits and support they had earned. Over the years, word of Otero Barreto's legend spread, and he earned a nickname that captured both his fighting spirit and his remarkable combat record, the Puerto Rican Rambo. Eventually, his extraordinary service began to be given the recognition it deserved. In 2006, the National Puerto Rican Coalition honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. His hometown of Vega Baja named him Citizen of the Year in 2011 and dedicated its military museum to him. A transitional home for homeless veterans in Springfield, Massachusetts bears his name. In 2016, Lieutenant General Joseph Anderson presented him with the Distinguished Member of the 502nd Regiment Award, recognition that, as Anderson noted, was long overdue. At the ceremony, Anderson spoke of Otero Barreto's remarkable survival, quote, "By all accounts, based on what he has done, he should be dead 5 or 6 times over. But there he is, standing there. He's a lucky man." Even after his passing in October 2024, at the age of 87, efforts continue to upgrade one of his silver stars to the Medal of Honor, with supporters arguing that his actions at Phuoc Yen merit the recognition. Whether or not that campaign succeeds, Jorge Otero Barreto's legacy is secure. He'd set out in 1959 to become somebody to be proud of. 5 tours, 200-plus combat missions, 38 decorations, and a lifetime of service to his fellow veterans later. There's no doubt that he achieved that goal, and so much more.